Got Matt Lowry on the line talking USC football. The Trojans have yet to hit the practice field here for the spring of 21. We're awaiting word on when that's going to be. Should be here in a few weeks. Talking offensive line. Now we look at the schedule. Pac-12 released its slate for all the teams just a couple of weeks ago. As always, Matt, USC doesn't shy away from anyone. They have the annual Notre Dame game out there in South Bend coming up late in October. Their other out-of-conference games include an interesting finale to the season against BYU. That's very odd, where it's usually UCLA, and then if the Notre Dame game every other year, it's another Pac-12 opponent, but it's BYU at the LA Coliseum. And then even their opener, the other third non-conference game where most teams take on an FCS, a really lowly ranked group of five, or a couple of those at least. USC, they've got the Mountain West Conference champion in San Jose State, so it's a loaded schedule.
Yes, it is. And especially, it's a tough one. You know, San Jose State, I think, went undefeated up until the bowl game. Actually, as you mentioned, they won the Mountain West championship. They come to the Coliseum now. Interesting thing about the San Jose State game, and a lot of people, I'm sure they know about this. This was the game that was supposed to be USC and UC Davis. If everybody remembers, before Mike Bone came in and took over, USC scheduled UC Davis. The reason for it was because USC wanted to try to get more home games. They wanted to work out a schedule where they had more home games. And so they ended up scheduling UC Davis. I want to say not last year. It was about 2 years ago, actually, that game was scheduled. So they scheduled that game. A lot of USC fans were very unhappy with it. As you know, Mark, USC right now, currently as it stands, is one of three FBS teams to have not played an FCS opponent since college football split the Division I subdivision into two subdivisions. The others being Notre Dame and UCLA. However, I believe next season or in 2 years, UCLA comes off that list as they schedule three historical Black college and universities for I guess in the next 2 years and the next 3 years or so. So that list will now come down to two, being USC and Notre Dame, to have never played an FCS opponent. So that's how San Jose State got onto this schedule. That should be a challenge there. Another tidbit I know a lot of people are confused about with BYU being the finale is that the game was scheduled when they came to the agreement to have the BYU games. Mind you, the first meeting was in Provo, not last season, but 2 seasons ago. This will be the second of that, the second meeting, which takes place not Halloween, but Thanksgiving week. So that game was already set in stone. Well, if you remember, the Pac-12 championship game is the next week. So teams have to basically, if that game is already scheduled, USC has to play their finale the week before, their conference finale, which is usually UCLA. So that's why that game is scheduled not at the week before BYU. This is why BYU is the finale, because you have the Pac-12 championship the next week, and BYU is, the week before. So pretty it is interesting because we're used to Notre Dame being the last game if it's a non-conference, or UCLA being that last game, but something different this year, and pretty interesting, to say the least. But overall, if you look at the schedule, it's a tough schedule, but it's also a very favorable schedule for USC as well.
Yeah, I was going to point to that because if there's one thing that I can dive into and go on a rant for hours and hours concerning college football, it would be the playoff and its scheduling, because scheduling is screwed up in college football. So I'm not going to waste your time, Matt, but I could go on for hours, and I typically do. So people look up those videos, because I have certainly revamped college football scheduling because it's unfair. And I'll make this point. Listen to this stat, Matt. Since 1997, Baylor has not played a non-conference opponent that has been ranked. They have not played a ranked non-conference game since 1997. So what I did was, and I don't even know if USC has the most of these kind of games, ranked opponents out of conference, but they were the first team that came to mind because I have that kind of respect for USC scheduling. They always schedule tough. So I went back to 1997 for USC. They've played 24 ranked opponents out of conference since the last time Baylor played one. Now, if college football scheduling is not screwed up because of that. So I bring that up just to, again, outline that USC, it's not necessarily playing Alabama and Clemson every week, but they always play Notre Dame. So that's been a top 5 to 10 team in the nation the last few years. And they never play a non-quality opponent. San Jose State, BYU. Again, it's not even one of their tougher schedules from a non-conference standpoint, but it's still tougher than most by far. To your point about it not being that tough is I always look to see who you're playing in the other division because the Pac-12 lays it out that you got 12 conference, or you've got
I believe 9.
I believe it's obviously 9. You've got 9 conference games. You've got 11 possible opponents, so you're going to miss 2 opponents in the other division. Well, they miss Oregon and Washington.
Yes, they and they were supposed to play Oregon and Washington last season, but as you know, COVID ended up hitting and revamping the schedule a little bit. They did eventually play Oregon in the championship game. It was supposed to be Washington, but we all know how that went. But yeah, this season they avoid Oregon and Washington. As you know, they start off with Stanford, the usual usual Pac-12 opener, and then they get Washington State, they get Oregon State back-to-back weeks, I believe. You get Colorado, who they weren't able to play last season due to I believe a positive COVID test in the USC program. Utah comes to the Coliseum. Mind you, I don't think Utah has ever defeated the Trojans in Los Angeles. And this goes back to when they used to meet, way back when too, when they would occasionally play each other. But Utah has never beat the Trojans in Los Angeles. And then they get a bye week before they travel to South Bend to play Notre Dame. They didn't play Notre Dame last year due to the pandemic and due to Notre Dame joining the ACC. And then you get you get late into the season, you get Arizona at home. Mind you, they had a thriller with Arizona. You get Arizona State late in the season. That game should be, I think, between Utah and Arizona State. Those 2 games will determine the Pac-12 South. Then you travel to Berkeley, you play Cal. Then you have UCLA and BYU after that. Now, the biggest thing that stands out on this schedule, and I'm sure you've seen this too, Mark, USC, since the Pac-12 started, USC has always had to play a game on a weekday, either a Thursday night or a Friday night game. They always had a short week. If we remember, there was a season, I think it was the 2017 season, where USC didn't have a bye at all, and they had to play Cal on an afternoon, then play Washington State on a Friday night, then come back and play another game. So they always had a game where they had a short week. They have no weekday games, so they don't play on a Friday night at all. All of their games are on Saturday. So, and not only that, they get a very important bye, and we've all talked about the body blow effect with when you play Stanford or when you play Utah, those physical teams, right? Followed by another game. They play Utah, physical game. Then they get a bye, which gives them an extra week to prepare for Notre Dame. So that's huge for the Trojans. That's extremely huge for the Trojans. So again, this season they get, and we mentioned it, it's a tough schedule. Don't get me wrong. San Jose State, BYU, Colorado, Utah, who returns everybody on defense, Notre Dame. It's a tough schedule still, but it's a favorable one because it plays into USC's hands so much because you play, you get Stanford and then you go to Washington State and Oregon State, two teams who haven't really been up there. And then you get Colorado, who we'll see how they are coming into this season. But I think they'll be a good football team. Then you have Utah and then a bye. And then Notre Dame, the second half of your season, you're good from there. Is it a schedule that can make you go, you know what? They can run the table? I don't think so. I don't think they run the table on this schedule. Through the years, and we can go back to even the Pete Carroll years, USC tends to have a hiccup in one of those games. But it's something where you look at the schedule and you go, USC has a good chance to win at least 10 games on this schedule. And that's just based off of talent and who they have returning and whatnot. But again, Mark, you got to play the game on the field. You got to play the game still.
Well, if Colorado, I should say, if Colorado's as good as they were last year and continue to improve, it could be a little tricky 2-game stretch there, going to Colorado, then coming back to play Utah. But to your point, a bye week before Notre Dame. Of course, the conference games are more important unless they're in contention for a national championship. Then that Notre Dame game is going to be enormous. And from a rivalry standpoint, it is. And then to your point, along with Utah, the other important game in the division looks to be Arizona State on the road, but they've got possibly the worst team in the conference the week before. So they don't have to go back-to-back there because they've got Arizona at home before they've got to go to Arizona State.
Correct. And it's, again, it's a favor when we look at it, and when we look at every other teams compared to USC, it's a favorable schedule, but at the same time, it's not an easy one. And no. USC, USC's always had, and I'd say with the exception of last season, but again, different year, COVID year and everything, but USC tends to always have a tough schedule. And as you mentioned, Mark, USC always schedule tough out of conference. Always do. They always play a quality opponent, and that's including Notre Dame, who is always on their schedule. So by all means, USC always will tell you they don't back away from anybody. They'll go out, they'll play anybody any given time. We've seen it through the years. They've scheduled Alabama multiple times. So I mean, that should tell you something right there.
Yeah, if you go back to near the end of the Pete Carroll era, and again, you've got to always consider they always play Notre Dame. That would typically be enough for everybody else. But they've scheduled Alabama twice. They had a home and home with Ohio State near the end of Pete Carroll's era, BYU a few times. And yeah, certainly they've loaded up against just anybody that they can find out there. And of course, a series with Texas back-to-back home and home just a few years ago as well.
Yes.
Matt Lowry from Conquest Chronicles breaking down USC football for us. Join him and the rest of the staff there on SB Nation. Matt, we always appreciate you stopping by.
Thank you for having me. I always enjoy it, Mark.